turns out that Patricia is also from Grand Rapids. And knows a lot of the same people that I know, so that's a real plus. We were planning this yesterday, but it took way longer because our conversation came to diverge quite often. I wanted to mention a couple things prior to doing our readings, and that is some background. In 1998, when my husband Dick Kane was 66 years old, we started noticing signs of memory loss. He lived with dementia for 17 years. We had built a log house north of Deer River, and we had to sell it because it was very simple. I mean, we hauled and heated water, had a wood stove, and an outhouse. So obviously, most caregivers would not be interested in coming out to our place. So we moved into Grand Rapids in 2007 in order to have respite care for him while I was at work. And he remained in our home until the last 1.5 years of his life, then resided in an excellent assisted living facility very near my home. Dementia is an umbrella term that covers several neurocognitive disorders, including Alzheimer's, Lewy body, frontotemporal, and vascular dementias, all of which involve damage to the brain that leads to a decline in cognitive abilities such as memory, judgment, comprehension, logic, and language. Ultimately, Dick's physicians at Mayo Clinic thought Dick might have a mixed dementia that combined Alzheimer's with vascular and Lewy body dementias. Please keep in mind that my book explains one person's experience with dementia. Although there are some predictable symptoms, each type of dementia will manifest differently. Dick Kane's dementia was unique to Dick, manifesting in some ways that might be similar to, in other ways that may differ from what you have observed in other people who have dementia. I began writing these essays during the middle phase of Dick's decline. I couldn't leave him home alone, and so I would bring him along when I worked with a colleague named Susan Hawkinson, who was a friend of Patricia's. And we'd go up to Susan's house regularly so she and I could work on preparing our composition courses. And one evening, Susan said to me, "Annie, you have to write about this. People need to hear your story. They're so afraid of dementia, yet you two live with so much love and joy." And that's how it all began. I wrote one essay and then another, and then one day I discovered I had enough material for a book. So that's how this began.
My process, oh goodness, many words. So I haven't caregiving for anyone who has memory loss, but I have done a lot of caregiving for older people in my family. And the last of which was my mother, who was a widow for 4 years after almost 70 years of marriage. And so I discovered, I am an avid reader of daily meditation books. I have been for years, so I really love having a daily meditation book to read. And when I was going through caregiving, there were some that I drew upon or read, but when I got to the end of my experience after I lost my mother, I thought I really could have used a book that particularly addressed the strains and the challenges and the joys and the worthwhileness of caregiving. And so I started writing. I started writing them, and I drew a lot. I had written quite a bit about my mother's dying process. I thought it would be a memoir. It never really worked out as a memoir, but I found that a lot of the little bits and pieces that I'd written for that found their way into my meditation book. And thank goodness Jim Perlman of Holy Cow Press was interested. So he said, "Well, send me 25 and I'll see what I think." And so I sent him 25, and he decided he would gamble on publishing this book, which I'm truly grateful for. So then I continued to write them. I'm not sure I could have written them while I was caregiving. So for me, it needed to happen afterwards. I had the space Well, first of all, it takes a lot of time to find 365 quotes, I'll just say that. And there's one for every day, but it was a very rich way to kind of remember what I'd been through and really have the intention of it being a tool to help people, because caregiving can be very demanding, and so I really wanted a tool that would be helpful for people. So that was a lot of motivation also.
Thank you. Yeah, we're both published by Holy Cow Press. Originally, it began in Minneapolis. The publisher, Jim Perlman, has been in the business for more than 40 years now. And it moved to Duluth, I think because his wife got a job teaching at UMD in the English department. And so that's when he moved up to Duluth. And so they're a small independent press, which I really like. And so I've been trying to do as much as I can in independent bookstores as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to read a prologue from my book for you. And then Patricia will kind of do it back and forth. She'll read something, and then we worked this out yesterday, kind of. Sort of. Yeah,
Kind of.
Kind of, sort of. We'll probably digress again. But anyway, so this is a prologue from the book, and then at the end I'm going to read just a very brief excerpt from the epilogue. I often dream of my late husband. Sometimes he's healthy, sometimes he's ill with dementia, sometimes he's dead. 1 year after his death, I had this dream. I stand naked in a room. It's raining. Wind flings wet leaves against the large windows in the old brick building. Green, pale green, and blue leaves adhere to the wet glass. The muted sounds of wind and rain envelop me. Warmth radiates from my body. A man appears in a darkened room across the way. His back to me. I call out. I want to show myself to him. In many ways, our story is one of wanting. I was 24, and I wanted to meet an older man, a man who knew who he was, what he stood for, and what he wanted, who knew how to love. I met a man who was 41. He was tall and sinewy with the poise of an assured athlete. His kind eyes held me in a steady gaze. I wanted him, and he wanted me. Want in the sense of a strong attraction. Want in the sense of desire. I wanted to listen to his sonorous voice, to drink it in. I wanted to drink him in and savor his otherness. I had no desire to flirt or play games. I was heedless of propriety, and I was ardent, wanton. I ran my hand up his long, muzzled thigh, then kissed him. I got what I wanted. That's a little about me. I've never been into flirting. Anyway, I didn't want to be with a man who told me what I wanted to hear. I wanted candor. I came to understand that his integrity was what I most admired about Dick King. I wanted to be by his side, to partner with him in parenting his 3 children, in our writing, and in our work. I wanted to sustain our dialogues and debates, to pursue questions and aspirations together. I wanted to divine what I was made of. We wanted to live deliberately. We wanted to be aware of the sun's station in the sky season to season. We wanted to live our simple lives, scooping water, tending fire with regard. So 5 years after we met, we built a simple log cabin in Minnesota's North Woods. And thus we lived for almost 30 years. We did not want for much. Then his memory began to wane when he was 66. I didn't want to see the signs. I didn't want to say, my beloved has dementia. I wanted him back. The vivid, sexy, witty, quick, and curious man. But I could not will the disease away. I could not stay its incessant advance. For all my wanting, I could not, would not be able to get him back as he had been. I had this dream. I've lost him in a crowded room. I panic. Dick, where are you? I wanted us to go about living our lives as best we could. We would remain together in our home for as long as we could. We'd live in the moment, attending art openings and concerts, enjoying walks, our gardens, and our friends. Sometimes we'd simply sit in silence and watch lake waters ripple or the sunset. Throughout that time, we leaned on the powers of love and language. When words began to fail him, he recast language in novel ways. I wanted to capture his coinages. I wanted to make meaning of it all, so I recorded our passage through the 17 years of his decline. I needed to shape sentences into some kind of order amid dementia's disorder. I wrote onto the silence of a blank page in the silence of the night while he slept. I wove our story into essays. I wanted to tell the story of our experience as I understood it. I wanted to write an account of dementia as it manifested itself in the singularity of Dick Kane. I wanted to remain heedful of his dignity while bearing unflinching witness. I witnessed, but at times I couldn't be certain of what I was seeing. Due to the dementia, Dick often struggled to articulate what he felt or meant. I had to speculate. I wondered, perhaps, possibly, maybe. I wanted to be attentive to his observations, his coinages, his notes, jokes, songs, and anguished cries. I entitled my essays with his words, words he spoke or wrote over the years of his decline. I had this dream. One of his caregivers tells me that Dick has been writing minuets, but sometimes he doesn't get the 16th notes right. Because he was having language disabilities, so I'm sure that's part of it. I wanted to be with him even late in his life when he was toothless, stooped, his hair disheveled, beard unkempt. I told him he was my beautiful husband, and he was. Even as dementia altered him and the life we'd built together, I wanted to remain in the light of his love. He held fast to language, to his integrity, and to life. He declared, "Life is beautiful." He said, "I love life as it is." Then he grew frail and began to fail. He told me, "I've had enough of life." He wanted to take leave of this world. I had this dream. Dick is living by a dark and dismal sea. Cold waves encroach on his rough, spare hut. I did not want him to die, but he did. I wanted him back in order to make amends for the unraveling of my patience, for flare-ups fueled by fear. I wanted to reassure him that I survived my joie de vivre unscathed, to say once again that our love abides. After his death, I felt a profound longing, a deep want in the original meaning of the word, the Old Norse vanta, to be without. Uprooted, I hung in mid-air, hopelessly aching to be earthed in my husband again. So I brought my beloved back into the world with these words.
Well, I was going to read my preface next, but I'm going to switch our order, and I'm going to read your book blurb that I wrote for you first, because that's such a beautiful prologue. And last summer, Jim Perlman, the publisher for Holy Cow, sent me an email and said, I'm going to be publishing this book, memoir, written about someone who walked her husband through Alzheimer's to his end, and would you be willing to read the manuscript and write a book blurb? I'm like, oh, okay, sure, I'll give it a try. And so I sat down with this manuscript, and from the very beginning, from the prologue, I was found the material very compelling. So I'm going to read the blurb that's on the back of her book that I wrote, because it's my response to her book. In the Evening We'll Dance is a deeply enriching read. These lyrical essays fall seamlessly into a whole, providing a prism-like reflection on what it means to love, to truly and deeply love through the journey of dementia. These stories are continually drawn to the light, often through hard-earned dark passages. There is a page-turning suspense here as this mythic and even mystical journey unfolds, as Erickson weaves her own and her husband's insights with gleaned wisdom from fairy tales, literature, medical experts, philosophers, spiritual traditions, poetry, and song. Readers will be invited to deepen their own currents of meaningful love, whether living with dementia or any other of life's mysteries. We'll circle back to that last line in a minute, but I'm going to read a little bit from my introduction to it, because I pulled this, and I guess mine's a preface. Yours is what? Prologue. Okay, different word. Yeah, there you go. I'm just reading part of it here. I will always remember crossing the threshold of the hospital room my aunt was lying in. The stroke rendered her unable to drink water and made her speech difficult to understand. I had just driven 200 miles in response to the exhaustion I heard in my parents' voices. They and my other aunt and uncle, all my father's siblings, all in their 80s, had been attending to my aunt around the clock since her stroke. Decades earlier, this same group had come to my bedside during a near-death medical emergency, and their presence brought me enormous comfort then and eased my fears. Now, it was my turn to show up at a loved one's bedside. My initial feeling was that I didn't really know what I was doing or what I had to offer. I felt awkward and overwhelmed. I spent the next few hours watching how they all cared for her, talked to her, took turns, worked with the nurses. The depth and simplicity of their shared caring opened my heart in unexpected ways. My aunt herself, in her weakened state, had ways of communicating her needs and desires. What I learned in this initial round of caregiving was the importance of listening and paying attention, and the utter difference made by kind and simple gestures. Even on that first evening, as my solace shift in the hospital was at hand, after a few words of encouragement from my uncle before he headed out the door, my confidence had grown. When my aunt raised her hand out of a semi-sleep, I rose and held it. She clasped my hand tight. A simple gesture, deeply moving moment for me, comfort for her. A deep respect settled in me for what was happening among this group of loved ones, as it had decades earlier when I was so vulnerable. As I entered their world of caregiving, I felt immersed in a deeply meaningful, even sacred, mystery. Who we all were to each other, how we took turns shoring each other up, how we all felt connected by our concern for her vulnerability, touched and shaped me at deep levels. There have been many rounds of caregiving since then, as each one of that group at my aunt's bedside at some point became the most vulnerable one. As there were fewer of them, it became more important for me and my generation to step into this caregiver role. The last survivors of the group were my father and then my mother outliving him by 4 years. Through it all, I've learned that caregiving requires both hands-on practical assistance and an ability to see and listen with one's heart. Thus, the title of my book is Hands and Heart Together. The exhaustion that I heard in my parents' voice that day years ago, I have lived in my own bones. The lessons of love and action that I observed then, I've had many opportunities to practice over the years. I'm so grateful for the role models I had. As a caregiver, I found myself longing for a daily reflection book that was more specific to the challenges of caregiving. I longed for a meaningful reminder of my worth in this role. The beauty of a daily meditation book is that it travels well. It can be read in a short amount of time, which is a commodity hard to come by for most caregivers. Yet the words can carry a reader into a few centered moments, and those moments can shed light on all that the day holds. This book of daily reflections for caregivers lived inside me for a long time. It is the book I wish I'd had then. are we doing next?
You're okay. Well, the motivations are pretty clear for Patricia in terms of why she wrote her book of meditations. You know, it was something she wished she lacked in her life while she was doing this caregiving. And my motivations were to honor my late husband and to help other people. That's kind of it, you know, in terms of my motivations. But both of us are writing from lived experience. And I think that's important. I mean, people can see dementia or some other illness like a stroke from the outside, but to be with the person in the lived experience is a whole different thing. The novelist and philosopher Iris Murdoch had dementia near the end of her life, and her husband John Bailey wrote this wonderful memoir called Iris that was also made into film. And in it he said she still had the social graces, which Dick did too. He'd go out in public and he'd say, "Hello, how are you?" You'd be at Target and he'd ask a clerk, "Oh, do you have a boyfriend?" Young woman clerk, "Oh, do you have a boyfriend?" And then if they said no, he'd say, "What? A pretty young woman like you doesn't have a boyfriend?" So he would always get in an exchange with people, and he seemed, you know, because those pleasantries are some of the last things to go. And so John Bailey said he took her to gatherings with friends. And because there were a number of people, she'd be circulating among them, and she had all her pleasantries down, right? So at the end of the evening, the host or hostess would say, "Oh, Iris is doing really well, isn't she?" And he'd think, "You should see it at home." And so that's kind of, you know, you should see it at home, what this lived experience is like. And among the many things that I bear witness to in the book are experiences such as anger and guilt. And so Patricia's going to share a little bit about caregiver's guilt.
Yes. I'm going to read one of my meditations, which is about guilt. And I just want to, well, I grew up Catholic, so I was wired for guilt. But I would say that it was one of the challenges of caregiving because there was always something more I could or should be doing, or, you know, it was very difficult to balance different parts of my life with it. So I have a meditation here about guilt. And the quote at the top is, I forget the name of the book, it's back in my book there somewhere, but the authors are Barry Jacobs and Julia Mayer, and it's a book about caregiving. So the quote is, "Feelings of guilt are unavoidable when we care for a loved one. The best we can do is focus on the many good efforts we make, forgive ourselves for our mistakes, and continue doing our best." That's the end of the quote. I can say for certain that one of the hardest feelings I dealt with during my many months of caring for my mother was guilt. Like the stereotype goes, she was good at inviting it. But the responsibility was mine, whether to take it on or not. Still, most of us struggle with guilt when it comes to caregiving. We run into limits of time and emotional patience. Sometimes we need to say no for reasons that are completely understandable, but are not necessarily understood by our loved one. I remember once or twice closing the door to my mother's apartment in her assisted living place and resting my head against the wall and telling myself, "It's okay, you did the best you can for today. That is enough." When we're in it for the long haul, we need to find ways to take care of ourselves without plunging into guilt when we disappoint our loved one. When guilt does rear its head, we can learn ways to let it go, to observe it, but not let it get us down. And in doing so, we are ultimately protecting our ability to continue to care for our loved one. Each of these meditations has sort of a takeaway message. So the takeaway message for this one is the guiltometer. It's a thing. It may kick in, but I can learn how to quiet it more quickly by remembering that the limits I set help keep me sane and healthy enough to come back the next time in good spirits.
And then I'll talk about anger. Each chapter and each essay in this book is entitled with something Dick either wrote or said during the 17 years of is entitled, "That's Not Becoming of You." So, there's a quote that I began it with from the Buddha, which is, "You will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger." So then that's that guilt that comes in, you know. And so one example in this essay is of, I was still working at the college, I was still teaching English at the college, and so I'd be all dressed up and ready to go, and I always had to have him clothed, toileted, his meds in him, and his hot cereal ready before I left, because I knew he'd probably resist any of those activities with the respite worker, and so I was one who did those things. So here I am all ready to go to work, and then we have a toileting mess. And I was swearing like a trooper, as I usually do, and you know, and he was, "No, that's not becoming you." It's like, what, Dick Kane? Not letting me swear? What's this? And I said, "I have every right, I'm angry." And so one particular day, when after this happened, we finally got him dressed and downstairs, he got his meds in him, and I'm fixing his hot cereal. Well, I dislike loud noises, and Dick Kane disliked loud noises. So I was slamming the pot on the stove, and I was stirring it with a vehemence, and so it made all kinds of racket. And he's quietly sitting at the table waiting for his hot cereal. And all of a sudden he said, "Annie, can we be done with this now?" And so I stopped my stirring and went over to him and wrapped my arms around him and kissed him and told him I loved him. He had a way of diffusing my anger, often. And I told one of my many guilt stories to a therapist I was seeing to try and stay sane throughout all of this. And I got done, and she'd always say, "Well, you're only human. You're bound to feel angry at times." And then she said, "Not everybody's married to the Dalai Lama." But in a way that makes it even worse, because he's so forgiving and loving, and I'm being this angry woman, you know. So anyway, that's my story about my anger. And so I have a whole chapter about anger, because I knew that anybody who has done caregiving would not trust this book or trust me if I did not write about getting angry. It's just inevitable. You are going to get angry. And the thing is, the response to fear, which is a big part of what dealing with someone who is dying, and in the case of dementia, you might not understand exactly what's going on or why they're reacting the way they are, is fear. And our human reactions to fear tend to be to freeze, to flee, or to fight. Well, I had to take care of him. So I couldn't freeze, I couldn't flee, so I fought. And so that, it was just that anger coming out at times. So that's the guiltometer, the guiltometer. Mine would go up very high sometimes. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna read a passage now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Some people might feel that the person with dementia has become a stranger, completely sundered from the person he or she was in the past. They might feel the need to turn away from their loved one, for it seems as if she or he is already gone. At times, Dick was seemingly gone. Often, he was present. Even as he became more not himself, in some respects with the loss of memory and abilities, his indwelling being endured. I sought out what remained, and I was surprised by what was gained in the wake of the loss. Sometimes like a guttering flame, an unselfed being would shine out, transcending his ego self. He was both present and absent, here and gone. In the first years of Dick's forgetfulness, I saw things dimly. Gradually, living with dementia burned away all my illusions. As the art critic Peter Sheldell notes, hard light is wanted in a crisis, away with moonbeams. In that hard light, I saw things as they really were, and I pledged to bear witness. And I tend to be one of those moonbeam people generally. So I tend to, be an optimist and have a real sense of joie de vivre, and I am an idealist and something of a romantic. But my Norwegianness came out. So my Norwegianness was a part of me that could actually look at things and bear witness, and could deal with the hard stuff, I think, because of that.
In our Anne Marie's and my wonderful rambling conversation yesterday, and she's of Norwegian descent. My son lives in Norway. I have Norwegian American grandchildren. The 200 miles I drove in this, which I mentioned in my preface there, was from Minneapolis to Grand Rapids, which was where my elderly people were until they had to come, until my mother had to come down here near the end in the cities. But lots of wonderful connections. So we talked a lot about bearing witness, being present. And so I'm going to read a meditation. It wasn't the one I was planning to read yesterday, forgive me, but it is about paying attention to the moment. And one of the things about caregiving, there's a lot of hard things, but there's also a lot of really beautiful, special moments, tender moments, I would say. And so this one is about that. It also includes my daughter who's here tonight, so it's a great opportunity to read it. And the quote is from St. Augustine: "Love is the beauty of the soul." There's so many kinds of beauty in this world, and the awareness and appreciation of beauty almost always uplifts us. I remember noticing how beautiful my mother's face was in certain moments, and I was struck that beauty can be seen in a 95-year-old face. Sometimes a beautiful fresh flower gave us reason to pause and feel the full force of its special texture, color, and scent. There were unexpected and beautiful moments. One of my favorite beautiful moments took place when my daughter accompanied me one day when my mom, her grandmother, was in a rehab facility. It was no one's favorite place, and we were all grateful it was temporary. Entering that hard place was easier for me with my daughter at my side. When we arrived, Mom asked for her back to be rubbed. Usually I did so, but this day my daughter stepped in. As her grandmother oh'd and awed with the relief she felt from a simple back rub, she told us how she prays for us, all of the time. Tears flowed down my daughter's face and my own, as the power of loving touch transformed my mother's day, and the force of her life filled the room with a special light. And the takeaway from that one is, one way to uplift and sustain myself on this journey is to honor the moments of beauty that happen and allow them to fully enter and energize me.
Just to add to that, the three things that kept us going, besides love, of course, was Dick and I were language, and our love of language and playing with words, which was forever with us, and music, again, forever, a lot of jazz, some classical, some kind of blue, a nice variety of music, and touch. Touch was really important as well. And it's one of the last senses to die. Hearing and touch are the last senses to go in the end of our lives. So, and Dick would have these moments where he would just be luminous. He would be absolutely still and so peaceful. And I have a friend, Susan, who is always months ahead of herself. And I always say, Susan, you're way ahead of yourself, come back. She'd have worries about things way into the future. But she'd go and visit Dick, and she'd say, sometimes we talk, and sometimes I understood what he said, and sometimes I didn't, but that was okay. Sometimes he was silent, and in those those silent times, she felt the same thing I felt. And another friend, Sylvia, did too. Which is, you enter into, if you're present to the person in that moment, you too can enter into that space of just being here at peace now. And if you think about it, people with dementia don't have much of any past left, right? And if you don't have that, you probably don't have a sense of future. I didn't. So he's in the now, which is what many religions aspire to be in the now. So being present, as you mentioned, is just very important, I think, and it's still a relationship, even though it's in utter silence. And I felt like I was in a holy moment. So that resonates with what Patricia wrote too. It wasn't Dick who was holy, God forbid, but he was feisty and funny and quirky and curious and fidgety, and he was 101 other things and very wise sometimes. But I would never use the word holy. I don't use the word holy. I use words like beautiful or odd, you know. And so the word sitting next to him when it said, this word holy came into mind, I was kind of shocked. I thought, that's really woo-woo, you know, I don't know. But then I thought about it and I realized, yeah, it's experience. It's experience. And so you entered into that, your daughter did, with your mother. And so no words need to be spoken sometimes. Yeah.
I wanted to read today's meditation just because it's also about being present, and it's the meditation for today, and then I'm going to move into reading a little bit of a closing passage here. So, October 1st, the quote is, "Be here now, be somewhere else later. Is that so hard?" By Ram Dass. So, speaking of being present. Caregiving took me to some unusual places: assisted living, rehab facilities, doctor's offices, physical therapy, occupational therapy, a nursing home, hospital ERs, hospital rooms, tables surrounded by people older than I. Navigating different systems, different hierarchies, and unique personalities could be dizzying. If anything, it taught me to be flexible and how to be better at thinking on my feet. I still remember the kind and vibrant energy of many of the people who helped us with our mother. A lot of humanity happens in all of these places. Vulnerability creates openings for compassion. The kindness of a particular physical therapist who encouraged and helped my mom get back to walking after a bad fall still reverberates inside of me. Her appreciation for my mother's courage helped me to see that courage more clearly myself. Over and over, I learned how much the kindness of anyone I ran into in all of those places touched me and my mother. Their actions warmed our hearts and our day. Wherever a caregiving journey takes me, if I fully enter the space of the here and now, there will be gifts and learning for me. I have a theme going here. I wanted to read the words from Rosalind Carter, which I think there's a whole caregiving center in DC somewhere, and I meant to do some research on this, but I didn't. I used it as an opening quote for one of my meditations. I'm not going to read the meditation, but I want to read the quote. Okay, from Rosalind Carter. There are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver. Covers all of us. And then I think I'm ready to close it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to read just a little closing section of my prologue, and then Anne Marie's going to read part of her epilogue, and then we're going to open it up for questions, right? Yes. Okay. We all come to caregiving in different ways, and each situation has its own special challenges. Caregiving in any way entails wrestling with a few soul-searching questions. 1, what kind of human being do I want to be? 2, who has this loved one been to me, and what am I willing and able to give in return? And 3, how would I want to be cared for, and by whom, if I were to be the most vulnerable one. The reflections in my book are intended to help sustain and inspire caregivers, yet they are useful for anyone who is part of a support team for a caregiver. Many caregivers say they couldn't have done it if they hadn't had a supportive spouse or friend. So whether you are a primary or secondary caregiver or the one who supports the caregiver, your role matters and makes a difference. The caregiving path is not for the faint of heart, but it is filled with gentle and surprising gifts. Caregiving is a journey that won't last forever, although sometimes it feels like it is. Yet, its gifts will shed light upon you for the rest of your life. I really believe that. So,
I concur on this. I have a very brief passage I'm going to read from the epilogue. Before I do so, I want to tell you that Dick's former wife is here. All three of his children are here. And two of the grandchildren are here. So he lives on. These essays were written about Dick, but they were also written to him. As such, they resemble a literary apostrophe, a passage in a poem or play in which the speaker addresses someone who isn't present. I address my late husband. My love, this is what we lived through. This is how agonized and frightened and determined and loving we were. This is how valiant you were. As his life neared its end, Dick told me, I love you the same as you love me. It keeps me moving. That love still keeps me moving. Any questions?
thank you all for being here. It's so wonderful to have so many people interested in caregiving.
Yeah, and thanks to Majors and Quinn and to Rachel and the events planner Annie. Her name's Annie too. Yeah, for Majors and Quinn hosting events like this. Really appreciate it. Any questions?
Wide open here.
Yeah. Yeah.
17 years then was the journey with this Alzheimer's.
Right.
Were you keeping notes or diaries?
Yeah, I explain that in the book because otherwise you're gonna doubt that. Did he really say that? Did this really happen? You know, I had started. He was saying these amazing things, and so I would write them down. In fact, I write some of them down while driving the car, which people said, "Don't put that in your book." You know, I'd be driving, and I'd grab a pencil and paper and put it on the dashboard and write down because I didn't want to lose it. And then I'd start typing. I have commonplace books where you throw poems and drawings and quotations you like and everything. And so they started showing up there. And then I started putting them into my phone because he'd make up these wonderful words. Because his sentence structure, the syntax is perfect. But nouns little elude him sometimes. He just couldn't think of the noun. And so like he looked down at his hand once and he said something about his nimnits. And he said, "You mean your knuckles?" And he said, yes, I said that wrong, you know. And sometimes he'd make up a word, and then he'd get done with it, and he'd look back at it and say, "What the hell was I saying? That's not a word," you know. And so he had this interesting, complex relationship with words. And so I was writing all of that down. And then when he was in the facility the last year and a half, they actually left notes for me too, because they knew I was working on the book. It was so sweet. This is what Dick said today, you know, which is wonderful. And then both of us had always kept good engagement calendars. So I could actually go back. It's like, what year did he see the neurologist and have this one test? And there it would be in my engagement book. And then his engagement books. And then in 2005, looking back, I realized that's when everything really fell apart. His engagement book fell apart for him, you know. So I had all this evidence, and then I had the discharge statements too from Mayo Clinic and so on. So yeah, a pack rat, you might say. But it turned out to be extremely helpful to have all those resources. More questions? Yes.
I have a question about finding the courage for the difficult conversations. Because in the caregiving journey,
conversations that have to happen, especially the transitions when somebody has to be moved or when somebody, I've got one of my meditations, I won't be able to find it right now, is based on a quote from Atul Gawande, the doctor who's wrote Mortal Being, I think that's the name of the book, Mortal Being. On Being Mortal, thank you. Words getting mixed up. And he writes about when his father switched from always had to try to, like all of his life, his father had been someone who was like, you gotta, do your best and work your hardest, and then at a certain point, there was a switch to just letting go, and what an important transition that was for him to honor and to talk about. And I do use that as a moment in my book to talk about having the courage to know when there's a change, and that has to be communicated. Maybe more differently if someone has dementia. I think that gets a little trickier in terms of communicating, but I think there's something about just summoning up that energy for the things that have to be done, that need to be done for the best kind of care to happen for yourself and your loved one.
And the transition, the one time in the whole history of our being together that Dick was violent towards me was after Mayo Clinic physicians said, you can no longer drive. And I had hid the spare keys, and the other keys were in my purse, and I was busily grading student papers or whatever, for my work. And then all of a sudden he was gone. And I went out to our garage, and he was in the car with the dog. And I thought, oh my God, did he find my key, the one I hid, or did he take it out of my purse? And I tried to get him to come out of the car, and he just would not get out of the car. He was just very angry. And that tends to be, with dementia, one of the really difficult times. And then when I had to sell the house so I could get caregivers in Grand Rapids, instead of a place where you had to haul and heat your water and go to another house, I brought him to our new house often before we actually moved in. And he would do things like piss on the floor in the basement. And then when we did the closing, he was there for the closing, and I was signing the papers because they had power of attorney, and he said, does this mean we're selling the log house? Well, we built that ourselves. It was Joe, the youngest of the kids. And we lived there for almost 30 years. And I said, yes, we can't afford to buy the new house unless we sell the log house. And he just started to cry. And the realtor just very wisely and politely left the room and just let us cry together. So that was another difficult transition. But what he would say relates to what she just quoted, which is, in the middle phase of his dementia, guy didn't know day, month, year, nothing, right? He would say, what is. And he'd say, life is beautiful as it is. And it took me a long time to catch up on him. To not fight the dementia and not try and, and so he was ahead of me in that regard. So yeah, there were difficult transitions, but in that sense, he made that transition more obvious to me, even though it took me a while to get there. Other questions?
I appreciate the shout out to courage, because I do think caregiving takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about the process. I mean, first came the dementia, the memory things, lapses, and I was your friend who's now starting to do that. I want her to keep her autonomy, her confidence, her joy, and resisting it. But I have to sometimes kind of intercede so that she's not driving off the road and off the car with her out, more or less. But
We never really did because we never got a diagnosis until like 7 or more years into the dementia. We were first told it was probably little strokes. And then Mayo said probable Alzheimer's, but I went through the list of 6 signs of Alzheimer's. They said he only does 2 of this whole long list, right? So then a neurologist met with him, and she did this quiz where you just, name how many words you can that begin with the letter D or whatever. And he blew the standard out of the water. I mean, more than double what the cutoff was. And she probably had to stop him, you know. And so even when they asked point blank, is it Alzheimer's? The experts would say, no, we don't think so. And so by the time Mayo Clinic diagnosed him with Alzheimer's and eventually probable mixed dementia, he was beyond accepting or understanding what was going on. The best we could do was, we went out together all the time. We went to art openings, we went to jazz at the VFW, we went for walks, we went to restaurants. I mean, we just didn't quit doing the things that brought us joy. And my attitude was, luckily Grandpa's was they held us up in many ways. That community was wonderful. But my attitude was, this is the love of my life. If you can't handle seeing a guy with dementia, deal with it. We're going to do this stuff. And mainly people just took a message about love and marriage, and, the beauties of our relationship away. And so, but yeah, it's hard because, well, Mikey's particularly, it was really hard because he never really got a diagnosis until it was pretty far progressed.
I'm just trying to remember it in, when you guys kind of did sort of realize that something, this was coming up, he got very depressed.
Yeah, depression is one of the first signs often. And, there was something else I was going to say when it came up. But yeah, I noticed the checkbooks were getting screwed up, and he is much more mathematically inclined than I am. And then the kids noticed, they'd say, hey Dad, repeated the same story half an hour after he'd said it, so they started noticing those kinds of lapses. But he is a person who said, title of an essay, I seem to be making more mistakes. And he is the one who set up an appointment with his physician. And so that point was when he, something was off. But yeah, depression was his first, was the first thing with him too. Most of one depression. And there are rule-outs too. You need to check to make sure the thyroid levels are okay and so on. His doctor was very thorough about all the rule-outs to make sure these lapses weren't because of some physical problem. So yeah, that's important. Anything, Kay, any more?
I like to equal sense of presence,
Mm-hmm.
and just the gift of being present with the person as you know them for that moment. Not the person from years ago, or not the person, whatever, tomorrow. Just to be absolutely present, which I very much appreciate that.
Yeah, it was so important. And then the other thing I would do, which I realized is I was mirroring him, what I knew of him, what I loved in him. And so it's like I still see this kind and gentle man. I still see, and I think that's helpful because some psychologists use mirroring as a way to help people who don't have a strong sense of themselves. But with him it was, and then always I loved Martin Buber, reading Buber when I was in college, and so it was like I thou, honoring that other person wherever he or she is in terms of the dimension, yeah. But yeah, just mirror back. It's like, I would just say, you're my love, you're my kind of gentle and broad and handsome love, and yeah. And so you keep reinforcing that, what you're seeing. Cynthia.
I just spent a day near a friend with dementia. And Carol is constantly angry at her husband Art, but he needs to caretake. He needs to dress her. He needs to find her phone in the refrigerator. He needs to, and she's angry about that constantly. And I can see that Art is
nice. I mean, he didn't get angry about the caring that I did, in terms of dressing him usually. There were times like I needed to go to work and I'd have to get him up out of bed so I could do the dressing, the toileting, the meds, and hot cereal, and he wouldn't get up. So, I mean, there was like once I just yanked all the covers off the bed, and I mean, I was in tears. But I was 17 years younger than Dick, and I think that I could not have done what I did as long as I did if I had been his age. I think it's extreme. They say often the caregiver predeceases the person with the dementia. That's how stressful it is. Yeah, but that anger, Dick was on a number of meds too, and so I would look at maybe them trying to adjust her meds, whatever she's on. He also got electroshock treatments there for the last years of his life because he would get highly agitated. And the respite care workers I had in home would just say, I think it's time, and it was usually like a week before he was due for the electroshock. And they don't know, Mayo started it, and they don't know exactly how it works. His geriatric psychiatrist didn't even, but it would just calm him down, and it would also, he would more lucid. He would regain some of his intellect. And a friend of mine's husband had Parkinsonian-related dementia, and he too had electroshock at Mayo. And she said the same thing. She said, yeah, Kent's more with it. I mean, it's just after. And so there are things, I really highly recommend geriatric psychiatric unit at Mayo Clinic. I mean, it's just, it was a lifesaver, really.
Any other questions? I have a small response to that just the statistics about caregivers burning out are really high, and I do think there are a lot of creative possibilities out there, a lot of creative solutions. And I was, even though my mother didn't have dementia, there were times that we would bump into problems, and if I asked around enough, or just sometimes there were amazing solutions, or even community help available, because it sounds like that situation doesn't sound very sustainable. So some kind of creative outside of the box, seeking help, finding community support or something might be helpful.
Well, and then they talk about redirecting, and I would do that with him. I know they say, some people say it's not a good thing, but if you were getting agitated, I'd say, Phoenix, our dog, needs a walk. Or, or I'd start singing or something, and so just he'd have his mind off whatever that pattern was at the time, and that helped. And the other thing I did, once he had a trailing accident, and his bed covers were wet, and his pajamas were wet, and I had to go to work the next morning, or up in the middle of the night, and I just took her, all the bedding off and his pajamas. And he was on a trailer, and I said, now you need to take off your pajama bottoms. And he said, no. And I said, yes, they're wet. I put his hand in them. I said, feel, can't you feel they're wet? I said, you can't go to bed with wet pajama bottoms. And he refused. And he was 6'1", and he stood up, and very muscular, very wired. He stood up in our small bathroom, and we're facing a face-off, like in the movies. And I just said to him, look at me. And that would diffuse it. If we looked in each other's eyes, it just dropped away. Just look at me. I could never stay angry at him when I looked him in the eyes, and so I thought, I'll try that, and it just immediately, he was cooperative, and we could change his pajama bottoms and everything. It was like he saw me. And so, and I think sometimes there was a woman in one of the care facility who would scream and shout and holler every time they gave her a shower. It was horrible. But I thought she was probably a modest woman, and these strangers are taking her clothes off. And so, part of it could just be that this man is doing this stuff that, men aren't supposed to do, or anybody's supposed to do. Yeah, so it could be that. It's always good to ask where it's coming from. It's usually a fear or illness, something like that, that violence comes from. And you just have to ask yourself, keep asking, where is that coming from? And how can, like you say, how can we work around that? It ain't easy.
I have like a quick question, well, not quick, but, the process of just passing, I took care of my sister, she did have to have hospice care, and I couldn't physically take care of her that much anymore, right? I would spend my days with her, bring friends in, and, just try to entertain her, but let her have the peace and quiet that sometimes she needed. She actually told me that sometimes the people were there, and she was tired, she just pretended she was asleep. So she was a feisty woman. But at the end of her days, the last day we had to go to the nursing team, wonderful nursing team, said she's very close to death. My cousin is a geriatric nurse at the same thing. So, I had to go home and get my meds, my heart meds and such. And then I was going to the vet, so I said, Sandy, just hang in there, oh, we have to go. But is it true that sometimes people don't want others around them? My sister was very private. And so could it be something like that, that they do want to not have when they're alone, when they have? Have you found that?
I've heard that. I'm not a death doula. I don't work with a lot of death and dying cases, but I have heard that some people prefer that. I feel very lucky that my parents both allowed me to be with them in their last moments. It's a gift I will treasure for the rest of my life, but it doesn't always work that way.
Dick was in hospice actually 3 times because he had bad strokes twice before he actually died. Bad enough that doctors didn't know. I mean, he wasn't able to eat, sit up straight, so on. But what they tell me was, he loves you so much, you need to tell him that you're going to be okay. You need to let it, say it's okay to let go. And I would tell him that. And once I told him that, and he was really quiet for a while, he said, she'll be okay. And so, so there is that. I mean, it's just that whole let it go. I mean, his last night I spent in the bed with him the whole night and just sang to him and talked to him. And he was in a coma, but they say we could still hear and feel him, so I just did that. But and with my mom too, I was with her when she died. But each person's different. I mean, if Sandy was a really private person, she just wanted to go. Yeah.
What are you doing, Rachel? Is it time to move to book signing? Or?
Yeah, we can move on if you want. Yeah.
Is it time? Okay. Anybody else have a last question? Any other questions?
Thanks for a really good.
Okay.
Thanks for coming tonight, everybody.